Okay, welcome everybody. Just sort of give it a minute as people, I'm seeing the attendees still coming in, and the numbers are still clocking up. So I'm just going to give it a minute or two, if you don't mind. Okay. Welcome everybody. Looking at the numbers and people clocking in, I think there's nothing like Donald Trump to get everybody interested and trying to get a front seat to listen to what Trump has to say, good or bad. So this is a very specific, specifically focused webinar on what I've called Trumponomics, and essentially it's a focus on trying to understand Trump's economic policies in the first regime, and in a way use that as a vantage point for trying to understand what may come from Trump should he win the US election. And I know with Kamala Harris doing as well as she's done in the debate, there's sort of views about, well, it's a done deal and she's going to win, but it's a long period to November and things can change a lot. So Trump's very much still in the frame. And apart from then looking at what could be different this time if he comes into power for a second term, we'll also close off with looking at what the election statistical polling looks like. And the numbers you'll see were pre the debate yesterday. Okay, so I think it's a really important starting point analytically. That's why I have warning labels. Sorry, I seem to have an internet connection problem. Can you give me 1 second? And I'm asking the administrators to just come in quickly and tell me if they can still hear me, because I seem to have lost power. Is everything still okay, Zakira and company? Okay,
Yes,
they'll stop me if or somebody can type up if they've stopped hearing me. Let me just see. I'm getting sorry, let me just. Okay, everything's okay. Thank you to Graham, who's Graham Farrington, for answering. The challenge, the challenge, it seems, is often you hear you hear reflections that this was the Trump effect, or this was the effect of Obama on the US economy and so on. And what we need to guard against is the idea that you can attribute, right, specific outcomes or specific economic factors to a particular president. And so what I try and do in every single webinar of this type of this type is to actually pre-warn individuals and the audience that, look, causality is incredibly difficult to get to, right? Every single presidential period will be subject to what we call omitted variable bias or identification challenges or hysteresis effects. So what do I mean? Well, if we let's just look at the S&P for starters, right? So if you look at the S&P over the period on the top left here, you could attribute any single presidential period, right, to a rise in the S&P. If you look at Clinton, you could say, well, Clinton did wonderfully for the US economy if you just look at stock market returns. And you'll see this a lot in the electioneering that goes on, right? That somehow you've got these positive effects coming through to exchanges. Obama would be the same thing. And in the Bush period, the counters would say, well, Bush didn't do so well. Well, there are a whole lot of things going on and same with Trump, in each of these periods that are to do with interest rates changing, exogenous shocks, whether it's COVID, whether it's 9/11, inherited policies. So often Trump will say, well, my hands were tied because of Obamacare. As you'll see later, a lot of these presidential terms inherited a fiscal deficits. Fiscal deficits are key in constraining or, in fact, encouraging growth, either way, depending on the size of the deficit. So the long and short of it is the pure Trump effect. So trying to sort of measure the pure Trump effect on the economy is an incredibly difficult thing to do. You have to look for ascription. You have to look for, well, what is it that Trump specifically did to try and understand the impact of Trump on the economy? So if you the one thing you should come away from this webinar is the idea that attribution is very, very difficult, right? So I would caution against views or media statements, or even obviously political statements from either camp saying, well, during my term, the S&P did the following, or growth did the following. Very difficult to ascribe the economic impact of a president's term in terms of the pure metrics, in terms of how one thinks about the factors that impact on economic growth. On the right-hand side of an equation where you're trying to predict economic growth, you've got a whole lot of factors. You've got lots of noise, one of which is a presidential term. So the thing that I'm going to try and do, and I'll show you one more slide just to convince you in case you're not, in terms of attribution, the thing I'm going to try and do is to ask the question around what were the specific policies that Trump put in place, and based on those policies, can we understand what the potential economic impact was? So I try and take this big S&P graph and I show you this in a different way, perhaps a little bit more for our audience and our time period, a little bit more constrained a time period where we remember Obama and Trump and, of course, Biden. And you ask the question, well, let's look at the Dow Jones, let's look at interest rates and US GDP. Well, all of them can claim that during my period, GDP went up. Well, yeah, okay, fine. During the Trump period, he could claim the Dow Jones did really, really well. Look at the increase, but so can Obama, right? And in fact, Biden can claim something even greater in terms of what happened to the Dow Jones over his period. Now, I know this audience knows immediately and just viscerally, that that's not true. You cannot ascribe a Biden, Trump, or Obama effect to the Dow Jones. Likewise, what happens in the US economy is also going to result in, as we've seen in previous discussions around the interest rate, right? And what the Fed does. So Trump lived through a massive interest rate hike. That constrains growth, but it had nothing to do with Trump. It had a lot to do with COVID and supply chain constraints and so on. So where we have to concentrate our minds on in terms of thinking of the Trump effect is to start looking at the pure sort of impact of Trump, or what we would call White House specific policy interventions. And that's really where I want to go. So let's run through Trump's major fiscal policy decisions. So these are the ones that Trump, when he comes to power, he says, right, this is what I'm going to do. And the centerpiece, the absolute centerpiece of Trump's fiscal policy decision, or Trump's political term, is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA, right? The TCJA of 2017, in case people didn't know, comes in with Trump. It's a strong supply side measure. So Trump comes in as a supply sider. Trump comes in trying to help big business through company tax cuts, and we'll go through that, and of course, personal tax cuts, right? But these are all captured in something called the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And note something, right? This thing is only expiring in 2025. So effectively, right, this is something that Biden inherits. So again, any kind of tax effects on revenue or tax effects on growth, right, positive or negative, right, that people ascribe to Biden are in fact Trump's, positive or negative, right? So that's this point about ascription. Just be very clear about that. But the other thing that defines Trump's fiscal period, if you like, is the CARES Act, which is a COVID response act, which is again an exogenous shock. So truly, right? And in a pure sort of impact sense, the factor that matters the most, or the one that isolates Trump's impact on the economy, is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? That's the one that he brings to bear in terms of his presidential ambition. What is it? Well, it's the most significant. I think this is really important. It's the most significant corporate and personal income tax change in the US economy for over 40 years, right? And it involves substantial changes to rates and bases of both individual and corporate income taxes. And he, as we'll see, he redesigns very much both global, international rules and domestic rules for US companies in particular. And then significant changes in household income deductions. So what does it involve? Well, the components that are both household and corporate, as we've discussed, but I'll give you here one graphic which just shows taxable income. So this is household income, and you look at the marginal tax rate pre Trump's TCJA, and then what the TCJA does. And visually, so this is important, right? You have to look at the data as well as the visual. Here, you look at this and you think, well, these are substantial cuts across the income distribution. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. But the one that does stand out, obviously, right, is the top marginal tax rate. And that does fall dramatically from about 39.6% to 37%. And hence the notion from the Democrats and from unionists in the US and so on, that Trump has enacted tax cuts for the rich, right? And in many ways, that is borne out by the data. So you do see big and deep tax cuts, and I'll show you in the next slide for those at the top end. But that probably is not a sufficiently detailed assessment of what the TCJA does for household income, right? So what Trump manages also is deep cuts for those at the bottom end, okay? And if you just park that top and bottom, and I'll come to this in terms of the politics of what I think Trump is doing. But there are hidden in there a whole lot of tax cuts that probably don't get enough airtime, right? So he's got personal independent exemptions, right, which he replaces by larger standard deductions and expanded child tax credits. I mean, we're not doing a full sort of tax detail of tax deep dive into Trump, but these are the kinds of things. He's got new limits to itemized deductions, and here what he goes for is state and local taxes and mortgage interest. So he's able to go deep into people's state and local taxes, and he reduces those. He relaxes the alternative minimum tax rules, right? So that fewer taxpayers get affected. And here's the big one. He looks at personal income earned by small businesses, right? And he allows for greater pass-throughs of incomes, right? And effectively, he lowers the marginal tax rate for the self-employed. So in many ways, Trump has a very specific impact on the top end, the bottom end, and the self-employed. But what this graphic here, right, misses out is a really important shift in the nature of the tax regime across the distribution. And so what I've got here is a graphic which shows the income group, so whether it's the bottom quintile right through to the top 0.1%, and I look at the percentage change in the tax rate across this period. What's very clear is there's massive or deep tax cuts at the bottom, right? And much deeper at the top relative to the middle of the distribution. So in some ways, the politics almost of Trump's tax cuts is to go for the American working class, so deep cuts at the bottom end, and the super rich. And in many ways, the middle classes in the American, or in the tax, in Trump's tax cuts, in his TCJA, the middle classes have seen the fewest reductions. And to some extent, that's his play. So he's gone after the super wealthy in terms of protecting them or incentivizing them with these massive tax cuts, and the American working class. Certainly the modeling work shows more specifically that high-income households have gained, the self-employed, those with children, and individuals that rent their home, which I think is part of the self-employed tag along. So here's an interesting point, right? Um, his tax cuts effectively redistribute to some extent from middle-class households to rich households. And I think that's where a lot of the disaffection around Trump comes from. What on the horizon, as you look to the Harris or Trump 2 regime, is what happens when this bill expires in 2025. So, and again, these are the details that perhaps we don't pick up from the CNN type coverage of the election and so on, is that whoever wins this election, right, has the opportunity to either extend it, right, so extend beyond 2025 or let it lapse. The noise we're getting, right, at least from the Harris and in fact the Biden when he was still trying to run, is that they will retain parts of TCJA for at least personal income, but they're going to look for cuts for middle income households, right? And maybe the working class, so a little bit more at the bottom end. What this effectively means, right, is that the Harris tax proposal is going to be a redistribution away from top end earners. So these guys are going to get fewer tax cuts, right? Or taxes will go up essentially post 25 for top earners, and they'll be redistributing to the bottom end where you're going to see tax cuts. Trump, it seems to me, may just continue for personal income tax along the same lines of the TCJA. But there's a little bit of a wrinkle that I'll talk to later around the revenue effects. But of course, the key effect, right, is that the key component of the TCJA is the corporate income tax component. And if you spend 30 seconds looking through the table on the left, you begin to see the nature the nature of these taxes. This is almost the centerpiece of the TCJA, which is significant reform to corporate income tax. Now, often what happens is in most political cycles, political leaders and parties will go after income taxes because that tends to buy you votes and it's quite tangible and so on. They very seldom do drastic changes to corporate income tax. And so I think in many ways, this is Trump's most bold political economic initiative, right? He goes out as far out as is possible as a supply sider, right? He's almost Reagan in nature, but almost stronger than Reagan, right? Because he reforms corporate tax regimes so much so that it's seen by many experts as the first and the biggest corporate tax shakeup for about 4 decades, right? What is the simplest way to think about it? It's that top tax rate. The top tax rate goes from 35 to 21%. Now, those of you we know from the South African side that even the 35 is high by US standards, by South African standards. So to go down to 21% is not only massive, but suggests that some of the supply side views around the strangling effect on corporate tax in the US was probably true. But he tacks on a whole lot of other things, right? There are a whole lot of investment incentives, tax thresholds, tax caps, and so on. And one can get to the details of it. But the big ones are increased investment incentives, but that's equipment heavy. So in other words, it's not, and you can see it below, it's not around buildings, it's more around equipments, right? Equipment and capital investments rather than building investments, what the US tax code calls structures. And then he also does specifically change tax treatment of US firms' foreign income. I don't have the formal details of that, but in essence, he looks at US multinationals and that becomes a more favorable tax environment for them through all the tax codes. I mean, I'm not a tax expert. I'm not an expert on US tax code. But what do these things, so the question then is, what is the effect, right? What is the effect of the tax cuts? Because one thing to look at tax cuts is quite another to say, well, A, did it end up increasing firms' investments or growth rates? And what did it do to revenue? And that's absolutely key. So what I've done is I do a deep dive into the academic literature. So right, for me, what's important is not what CNN says or what Fox News says. It's what are the proper sort of carefully curated academic studies say. So the first challenge, right, You do need to understand that firms are heterogeneous, right? So some firms may be heavy investors in property, right? So if you're a retailer, you need lots of distribution centers. So you're going to invest lots in property, in physical space. That was not tax deductible, right? However, if you are a R&D intensive chemicals plant, you're going to be investing a lot in capital equipment. Therefore, the tax deduction through TCJA would be larger for you. So because of the heterogeneity in firms, it's unclear how much firms viewed the tax cut as a significant incentive for investments. What we find, right, through a very carefully done study for the US, for US based and foreign firms by Harvard and Chicago University academics, is when you look at the impact, and this, it's carefully econometrically done, and you control for other effects and so on. They look at the tax regime before and after, and they ask what happened to investment before and after the TCJA. The graphic on the left is really important, right? And I urge you to go and read this sort of full NBR paper if you're really interested. Is for domestic firms, you see a significant increase in investment, right, based on the effective reduction in domestic taxes for domestic firms. You see this change in investment and it goes up dramatically. The same for US multinationals, although the elasticity response or the sensitivity of the response is smaller. So what you end up viewing is still positive effects for US multinationals, although smaller. So in detail, what do they find, right? For 1% decline in the effective cost of new domestic capital goods, domestic investment spending goes up by about 3%, right? And for the 1% decline in the cost of foreign capital investment, you also have a positive effect, although it's smaller, right? In essence, right, the long run effect on domestic capital, in other words, domestic investment, is about 7%, right? So you see a definite shift towards increased investment by firms, both domestic US firms and US multinationals, although the latter is smaller, from the corporate income tax cuts. So the investment news is positive, right? And that's the first step to assessing the effectiveness of this TCJA. The question, though, is, does the tax pay for itself? Because remember, if the tax cuts don't pay for themselves, well, they're going to be deficit enhancing. They're going to increase the deficit, right? So if they are not effective in incentivizing greater growth and investment, and therefore generating revenues, well, then the outcome is that a rising deficit has to pay for the continued bills of government, right? Simple. Government expenditure commitments remain what they are in essence. And so you'd better be sure your tax cuts pay for themselves, or at least pay for a portion of what they promised in terms of income raises and growth enhancements. What did we find? So the TCJA, right, the target, in order to pay for itself, more or less, right, needed to sort of reach about $150 billion a year, right? What did the researchers find? Well, very limited effects on the receipts from corporate income tax or other revenue sources, right? So you don't see a knock-on effects in terms of higher workers being, more workers being employed, because you've got these growth effects, and therefore tax or revenue from wages goes up and so on. That's very, very small, right? Specifically, right? The direct cost of 41% of the pre-TCJA corporate revenue that's lost, right? The clawback you get is only about 2 percentage points, right? So you've got effectively a 39% tax gap that you're trying to fill because your massive cuts are not paying for themselves, right? So the revenue clawbacks to the fiscus, in very simple terms, from these tax cuts were minimal. So the careful econometric and objective work shows, yes, big tick, the tax cuts from Trump did increase investment amongst US firms. So if you talk to a corporate investor and you'll see them on CNN and Fox News, they'll say it was fantastic. We opened this plant, we increased investment, and this, well, they weren't paying enough taxes to pay for themselves, right? So to pay for the tax to pay for itself. And so the US government and the specifically fiscal authorities have to deficit finance the revenue loss through the tax cuts. So that then got me to thinking, right? Was Trump a fiscal populist, as it were? And sorry, if you can give me 1 second, I seem to have a problem with. I'm going to switch off my video. I seem to have a problem with my power source, and I don't want to lose it in the middle of my presentation. So if you don't mind just bearing with me for a minute while I try and resolve this issue. Sorry. So apologies, I think I'm back, but it turns out we have a power failure in my area. So my laptop is losing power. So we may have a bit of drama, but we'll rearrange if need be. Okay, let's see how far I can get without my laptop dying on all of us. So one of the things that came to mind as I was doing this is that perhaps Trump is actually a populist, a fiscal populist. So maybe Trump is actually interested not so much in keeping the deficit low, but doing as much as possible for those fiscal populists who serve his political ends. So, of course, this is quite common amongst populists, right? So what you find is a fiscal populist is somebody who essentially will spend as much as possible to meet all political aims that he has, right? But he doesn't do that because he knows the economics of it is actually very, very scary for all his potential supporters, particularly those on the right, the sort of Friedman view of the world, the sort of anti-leftist view is you have to be austerity focused. You have to make sure that you don't run these massive deficits and so on. And in fact, he says that, right? So Trump comes into power and he says boastfully to Bob Woodward, he says, look, I can get rid of this US debt, 19 trillion, and I think I could do it fairly quickly. I think I could do it in 8 years. And that's a direct quote from Trump. Of course, that's virtually impossible, right? So as we know, if you just look at these deficit numbers, it's almost impossible, both politically, economically, and mathematically, frankly, right? And so if you look at just purely Medicare, if you look at Social Security, there is absolutely no way he could have done that. But actually, that was a ruse. So there's no way he could have reduced the deficit. The bigger question for me was looking at the data was to say, well, was he actually a fiscal populist, right? So lurking in the background for me was a question, and I'll get to answering it. It was, to what extent was Trump actually an expansionist in terms of fiscal policy? So not only was he unable to remove the US deficit, of course, but in fact, he was a deficit wolf in austere sheep's clothing, as it were. So what does he say, though? He says, I'm going to reduce this deficit by renegotiating trade deals. I'm going to bring overseas US companies, so these multinationals, back to America. So this whole idea of island, sort of for Apple Island as a tax haven would be removed, and so on. And he would repeal Obamacare, and that would save a whole lot of money for the fiscus. Of course, he does very little of any of this, right? Particularly the last two. What is a real question mark for me, right? And just purely on the economics, was Trump's massive failure to significantly reduce the deficit in a period, right, where he did have a growing economy. There were falling defense costs. Remember, he's one of the few presidents who's not waging wars during his presidency. And so defense spending is somewhat curtailed. But he also has a unified Republican Congress. So often these guys who are presidents say, well, I couldn't do this because I didn't control Congress. So even though I wanted to reduce the deficit, the Democrats or the Republicans prevented me from doing so. So this is lurking in the background in terms of, was Trump a fiscal populist? And right at the end, I'll show you what Trump looks like compared to Obama and Bush. And the numbers are super interesting. But so let's see, did he deliver? Obviously, he didn't deliver on a debt reduction, right? So because we know that the deficit is absolutely crazy. What's important, right, is to keep in mind that so this table is really useful because the Congressional Budget Office projects as it does. So think of it as, I guess, our national treasury, but maybe a division within our national treasury. And these are, the CBO guys are really important because they produce empirically, politically neutral figures on what's going to happen to the US deficit. And what they find is over the decade, based on just pure projections, the deficit should have been 10 trillion. So for us as South Africans, these numbers are, that's not a billion, that's 10 trillion, right? What they find, though, so that's the baseline budget deficit, what it should have been. What they find, actual values, so if you look at this here, down here, if I could just put on my laser pointer, is so the baseline budget deficit is over the years, it accumulates, and for the decade, it should have reached a sort of steady state of 10 trillion. What actually happens, actual values, is over this period, is that the deficit is projected to reach 14 trillion. So let's ask the question, what happened in terms of Trump's, in terms of the Trump period, in terms of contributions to the deficit, right? So at the beginning of his period, we end up at this 10 trillion figure, right? So that's the baseline. So in 2017, CBO does do their numbers and they say we should be at 10 trillion, but actually he ends up getting us to 14 trillion. So we're now left with, well, he actually contributes, right, 4 trillion to the deviation in the baseline estimate of the budget deficit. That's a Trump effect. It turns out it's actually more than 4 trillion in terms of pure White House policies. And so when you look at the total legislative and White House policies, that comes to just under 8 trillion. So Trump enacts actually 8 trillion worth of new initiatives, right, that are deficit enhancing. The clawback, right, the comeback, which partly, and some would argue mainly, have nothing to do with him, come through technical and what they call economic re-estimates, and that's 4 trillion. So effectively, right, that 4 trillion saves Trump from contributing 8 trillion to the deficit. And so the overall contribution to the deficit is just under this 4 trillion, or this 3.8, right? So what were the biggest drivers, right? The biggest drivers of Trump's sort of 7.8 trillion deficit package, his supply side economics, is effectively the CARES Act, right? So that, you could argue, is an exogenous shock. He had nothing to do with it, right? And we'll come back to whether Obama and Bush had similar COVID spending effects, if you like. In addition, though, his tax cuts contribute 2 trillion to the deficits. Now, we've seen those tax cuts, right? And then the legislation, right, which, if you look at the table on the left, and we don't have time, but you can look at the table on the left, which gives you all the detail, you can see that what he also does, apart from TCJA, is that he goes through all these discretionary caps that are lifted or increased for defense and non-defense. So that basically says, okay, but we had a cap, we're just going to increase it, right? So that sounds like a lot of deficit-hungry senators sitting in Congress that want, the cap on spending on bridges to be lifted, the cap on spending on energy subsidies to be lifted, and so on. And so that then becomes a feeding ground and a feeding frenzy, right, for senators that are trying to protect their state votes, or can give back to their state voters, and so on. In essence, what happens, right, is you have a contribution from the White House through under Trump, right, that leaves the US, or he leaves the White House with the largest peacetime budget deficit in American history, right? And so for the first time, what you have is a debt to GDP ratio exceeding 100% of the economy for the first time since World War II. Right? And you see the nominal figures of the debt jumping from 14 trillion to 21 trillion and projected to go to 29 trillion, right? Essentially, he doesn't deal, of course, with Social Security or Medicare. And so Trump becomes a major contributor to the US, the growth in the US deficit. The thing that we got to keep in mind is this distribution. So the burden of what Trump does relative to others, relative to other factors in terms of increasing the deficit to GDP ratio. What you see is this 7.8 trillion is Trump's specific policies, right? So Trump's specific policies are the ones that, in essence, are his making, right? So those are the policies that he enacts. Those are the policies that he's got to stand by, that he could have avoided. So when we start out at the beginning of this presentation, I said, you've got to think about the economic effect of Trump, right? And Trump's effect doesn't lie in S&P 500, in the US growth effects. Those are too macro. Those are really difficult to sort of estimate, right, and pin down. But what you can pin down is his effect on the deficit through programs that he enacted, that he pushed through with particularly in this case, with the dominant Republican Congress. And so we get to that 7.8 trillion, right? But as I said, he gets saved, or he would argue some of his policies resulted in economic growth revenues, and then you get technical re-estimates and so on. And in essence, right, those technical and growth revisions saves him an estimated 3.9, let's call it 4 trillion. So in effect, Trump spends, make it simple, let's round it off, 8 trillion deficit enhancing, and he claws back 4, right? And he basically increases the deficit by 4 trillion. So if you want, just purely statistically, purely on the basis of numbers, you cannot walk away from Trumponomics arguing that he is a fiscally austere guy. Trump is is in pure numbers is a deficit financer. Trump is interested in ensuring that governments and government policy is designed to serve specific, let's call it economic aims, independent of what it does to the deficit. He was not focused on reducing the deficit, right? And I think that's really important. So in the same way that he was interested in making sure that there were tax cuts, he was not really interested in saying, well, am I actually going to get back any of these tax cuts in the form of revenues, right? So none of that actually features in Trump's thinking, or certainly his team's thinking. So I'm still at this question, right, whether Trump was a fiscal populist in fiscal austere clothing. So the one thing we do know is he's not really focused on reducing the deficit. But was he a populist? So let's see, right? It's hard because in many ways, and I'll come to it right at the end of the Trump 1 section, if you like, the Trump regime section, is that, he inherits a deficit, and then you've got to compare him to Obama and Bush, and I'll show this in one slide. And what about COVID? The others didn't have COVID, and so on. And then, you could end up with a surplus, just basically. So if I go back to this, you could end up with a surplus if these guys here, the economic growth revenues and the technical re-estimates, all these things do a great job for you, but they had nothing to do with you, right? So he could have ended up with a surplus and claimed that he was an austere, anti-deficit politician, right? Even though he would have gotten lucky. So one way, though, right, is to try and understand what happens in terms of this legislation that was enacted, right? And if we go into detail, you find that roughly 1.3 trillion. So this is the evidence from sort of both the CBO and quite neutral political commentators, that 1.3 trillion of the new deficits reflect purely Republican policies. So of that, just think of it, of that 7.9 trillion, only 1.3 trillion were pure Republican votes, which they pushed through, and the Democrats voted against, right? But actually, the overwhelming majority, 6.5 trillion, resulted from bipartisan legislation. So in other words, the kind of legislation that both the Dems and the Republicans supported effectively. So what does that mean? It means that essentially both Republicans and Democrats are what I've called enthusiastic fiscal populists. Neither side can claim to be focused on heavily reducing the deficit, at least in this period and based on this evidence, right? So what Trump can definitely come away from saying is that, hang on, you can't sort of pin on me that I'm the deficit enhancer. Both these, the Dems also voted for this, and I think he'd be correct in saying that. Okay. So just moving on from deficits and so on, one of the other things that Trump does very clearly is to go for trade protectionism, and what he does very, very clearly is begin an era, and I think this is really important. So it struck me because I think we all get so busy and we read different things and we perhaps focus a lot on South Africa. It struck me that Trump coming to power is almost a global inflection point away from free trade. So this was a period under the WTO, from the grand sort of globalization period of the 70s and mainly the 80s with the East Asian economies, when tariffs were coming down. Tariffs, non-tariff barriers were dramatically being reduced the world over, and the idea from economists was seeping through into legislators, into politicians' worldview that lower trade barriers and tariffs were much, much better for growth. With Trump, that just ends, right? And so the notion of what is called deglobalization and also the idea of tariff wars suddenly begins. And this is not without substance. So what did surprise me, I knew this was at least true in terms of the statements and some of the data, but I was surprised going deeper into the data by the extent to which we've seen this rise in protectionism. So what did we actually see? So look at some of this data here, right? So this is data, again, that's, I think this is a Yale study, which shows a specific set of, so you can take products, you can take the number of, you can take the product type, you can take the number of products, and you can take the tariff value. All of them go up in terms of what's happened to protectionism. So just a few ideas, a few examples here. The average tariff rate goes up from 2.6%. So the import tariff goes up from 2.6% on average to 16.6%, right? And that's exactly in the first year of Trump's presidency. There's a massive pushback from the US against other countries, in particular China, but not only China. And I'll come to that now. How many products? Well, you could say 2.6 to 16. It's a multiple of 8, but it's only maybe 3% of, well, it's 12,000 products, right? Representing 12% of US imports. That's a big number, right? So suddenly the walls go up, right? So after more than 5 decades of the US preaching free trade, here comes Trump. And I think more than, although I'll get to it, the wall and immigration and so on, probably the most lasting effect, together with the tax cuts of Trump's economic policies, has been his sort of increased protectionism towards other countries. The idea that the way in which you grow the US economy is not through lowering trade barriers, but by increasing them, right, is an absolutely important and central feature of Trump's economic policies. But he doesn't stop there. So if you all, and I think we all remember these sort of visuals of Trump facing up to world leaders, right? A lot of that, and it wasn't just the Chinese, right? A lot of that was because of his extension of tariffs, an increase in tariffs beyond China into Canada, Mexico, and the EU. And so you see these tariffs across a range of products, right? Aluminium, iron and steel, washing machines, and the like. These are not just products that China produces, but other countries that are central and viewed as central sort of trade partners and also political allies of the US. So he starts a trade war that basically spills over into effectively a political war, right? Because, large voting blocs are aluminium and steel producers and exporters, or say in the EU or in Canada. Those large towns that are sending products to the US are reliant on low imports. And suddenly, this doesn't become a viable market for them. These are voting blocs for Canadian politicians, for European politicians, and so on. And so the trade war that he starts has political ramifications for a lot of leaders in other countries. And I think that's the subtle point that's often underappreciated. So he basically, the unintended consequence of his trade war, Trump's trade war, is to spill over into political challenges for leaders in the EU, Canada, Mexico, and other trading partners. But of course, every punch comes with the possibility of a counterpunch. And so what you do see, right, is that all trading partners responded in like terms. So what you see, and I've got it here in the little red square over here, is these are retaliatory tariffs on US exports enacted by trading partners in 2018. And I go from China, Mexico, Turkey, right through to Canada and Russia. And you'll see, right, that tariffs go up, interestingly, 7%, right up to 20%. So the average tariff, right, goes up from other countries, non-US economies, looking at US exports. Effectively, what Trump does is to start a trade war, right? So if you wanted the intestines and the specifics of a trade war, that's what Trump starts, right? And in many ways, what we have is the beginning of a trade war that Trump is central to, well, Trump is basically the enactor of, and the individual who starts that full-blown trade war. Now, it's often said that it's between the US and China, but what's very, very clear, if you look at the graphics on the right, is that there are a whole series, especially on the bottom right here, you see the retaliatory tariffs that come through almost in lockstep from Mexico, the EU, Turkey, Canada, and so on. China, of course, is possibly the one most affected, but it's very clear that they are not the only country, and it's also very clear that they're not the only country that retaliates. So what you have is the equivalent of a full-blown war, right, with other countries through the use of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. Now, what happens is there was anecdotal evidence that came through from media reports and specifically politicians saying, well, what you're doing so American politicians saying it's very clear that you're retaliating by going after American brands, right? And so you had this notion that American brands like Harley Davidson, produced in Wisconsin, by Paul Ryan. It's the home state of, you remember the Speaker of the House then was Paul Ryan, and the argument was that you're going straight after these iconic American brands and you've imposed these tariffs specifically to hurt us because it's an American brand. And this isn't, and there is no economic reasoning, it's political reasoning. All right. And so that then turns one into thinking that perhaps this isn't just a pure trade war based on, okay, well, we're trying to protect economic interests, but we're actually going to respond politically in kind. And so what does the evidence show? Well, this study from Yale University is fascinating, right? What it finds is that and if you look at the top right diagram is probably the best one, is in those states, right, where you had, and these are the red states, where you had a higher share of Republican votes, right? The highest share of Republican votes, that's the red. The share of exports affected by tariffs was higher. Very, very clear evidence, right? And they go through it very carefully in terms of the econometrics and so on. And it seems very clear that what the Chinese government, the Mexicans, the Canadians, and the Europeans have done is to specifically target higher tariffs, higher trade barriers for those states producing, for those states that are exporting products to their countries that are states which are specifically high Republican voting states. So red states or areas, very specific areas that are known to be strong Republican areas, are the ones that are hit the most by retaliatory tariffs. This is not a tariff war as much as it's a tariff war combined with political sanctions. And so essentially what we found, it's fascinating, right, is that those countries that from China right through to the EU have taken this very personally and have gone after Trump's base, right? And you can look at specific examples. So if you look at China and Mexico targeted pork and soybeans, which disproportionately affected Iowa, which was the home state of a Republican Senate Agriculture Committee member, Charles Grassley, right? Who I remember reading somewhere was quite influential in increasing tariffs against the Chinese and so on. So these retaliatory tariffs become an instrument of almost political pressure on Trump, right? And so the question then is, right, will this have a consequence? And so just to keep in mind that Trump thought this was a one-period game, and of course it never is, right? And so the response that comes back from trading partners is significant in terms of tariffs, but it's also politically biased towards his voter base. So he is immediately on the back foot in terms of his base now facing higher tariffs. And does it have an impact on those relevant US voters? Well, the answer is yes, right? So you've got this Penn Wharton Business School budget model, which shows that Trump's tariffs costs the median US household, right, with earnings of above 61,000 a year, about $500 to $550 a year, right? His tariffs and the cost, right, if you like, the welfare loss is the equivalent of raising Social Security taxes by 1 percentage point, right? So basically, he is disincentivizing median household workers in terms of wages. What you worry about, right, with higher import duties and higher tariffs, and that is, of course, what happens to landed prices or final prices. So importers will often pass on to consumers because the exporters are often not going to adjust prices downwards, right? Because this is now a cost that's been imposed by the receiving country and so on. And you do find that. So you do find 100% pass through of tariffs onto duty inclusive prices, which means a net loss to US consumers. That net loss to US consumers constitutes about 0.27% of GDP. Luckily, the general equilibrium effects are not massive. They're about 0.04% of GDP, which is still not insignificant, right, for an economy like the US. And that's because of the redistribution of from buyers of foreign goods to US producers, right? So there's a switch to domestic production, which is part of, I guess, Trump's aim in terms of higher tariffs, right? So he wants America back at work and he wants American-made goods and so on, right? But in net terms, it's still a loss. But of course, these effects, right, which I don't really discuss here, these effects are heterogeneous, which means that they're local economy effects, which don't matter that the overall GDP loss is 0.04%. So you can point that in your macro models. But if the steel worker in Pennsylvania is struggling, right, or the auto mechanic in Detroit has lost his or her jobs because the demand for their product has gone down because it's far more expensive now, well, that matters, right? Much more for the future elections. So this then leads to what I call these heterogeneous political effects. Because if these countries have targeted Trump's base, right, is that going to result in possible negative effects for Trump as he runs in this for a second term? In fact, there is a very clear real wage loss, right, for Republican-heavy areas that's found in the data. So this, again, is the Yale study, which shows the real wage loss. So if you look at this bottom graph, right, so real wages in tradable sectors only, right, as the the Republican share in that county increases, right, or the higher the Republican share was in the 2016 presidential votes. In other words, the higher the share of voters who voted for Trump in that county, the lower their wages are likely to be as a consequence of the elections since the tariff increases. So essentially, in simple terms, tradable sector workers in Trump areas have seen their real wages decline, right? And so that must be a real question in terms of whether that's going to affect Trump's electability for a second term. So moving on then, in terms of immigration, there's a lot of bluster, right, as we know, in terms of what Trump's done. And so I did have a question going into this. Well, did he really have an effect? And the answer is actually yes, right? So if you just look at legal immigration, right, you do find, so this is just pure legal data because, the illegal data is you can't trace the number of illegal migrants or undocumented migrants. But in the Trump era from 2017, you see a leveling off. So in fact, one of the interesting things about what Trump's done is, legal, let's call them skilled immigrants have actually walked away from the US, right? And in fact, that's been to the detriment of the US economy, particularly if you look at Chinese immigrants who are looking to base themselves in the US and possibly be more productive, highly skilled members, say, of Silicon Valley and so on, they've all walked away and they've gone back to China. So in many ways, he's lost the skilled legal worker base that the US used to thrive on in terms of driving productivity increases and so on, because of the flatlining that's happened, right? But of course, what gets into the press is exactly the stuff we know, which is his inhumane detention policies, the travel bans, remember the deportation force and so on. All of that becomes a feature of Trump's sort of immigration policy. It's unclear whether that's had a significant effect on illegal immigration, right? Because that number is still unclear, but we can definitively say that he's almost had the effect he didn't want, which is legal immigrants, possibly biased towards skilled workers, have actually walked away from the US instead of coming. So purely in terms of a skilled immigrant effect, it's probably a net negative for the US economy in terms of what Trump's done. So Trumponomics has actually been bad for skilled immigrants and therefore by extension bad for the US economy, particularly those firms and those sectors that are high productivity, high-end sectors looking for skilled immigrants in very niche areas. He goes for building a wall, right? That was a big feature of his immigration policy. And as we know, he leaves, right? Or the office without the wall being built, right? And so that's sort of a key feature of Trump's sort of term is incomplete projects, lots of bluster and lots of claim, but very, very short on detail and delivery, right? The other, I guess, what I would call very dangerous aspect of what Trump's done, and that bold statement there is really important, is that he perhaps in an unmeasured way, as an empirically unmeasured way, but certainly in a way that came through in terms of his public statements, was a political accelerant to global warming. So his political statements effectively fed the anti-climate change lobby, right? Yes, he does do things like remove the US from the Kyoto Protocol and so on, which then switches back when Biden comes into power, but he does restrict funding for scientific research. He basically appoints, if you remember, the environmental agency head was somebody who was a climate change denialist and so on. I mean, he does all these sort of crazy things, but in the domain of ideas, he's been very dangerous, right? He's undermined the science around climate change. He's painted environmental protection as job killing. He's gone to his base and said, well, in the Rust Belt states, you need to talk to the environmentalists who are not allowing you to dig holes in the ground. It's all these greenies that are protecting protecting little butterflies while you are starving. He does all that sort of stuff, which basically sets back the climate change movement tremendously. But what's really important in terms of the data, and that's this figure on the left, is what is called representative concentration pathways, which is estimated by the US's EPA, right? Is basically this would be the cost to climate change of all these damages that one sees in terms of US $1 billion, in terms of the climate change effects you're going to have through the different pathways. So in other words, if you have a damage to roads through floods, for example, that would be the US cost, which would be between, let's call it 3 and 16 billion, right? If you're on this concentration pathway, which is a greenhouse gas of 4.5, I think that's the average, but if it's higher, you're going to get a higher cost. And so you run through these projected costs, and what's very clear is that's the political accelerant effect that he has. So the more and more the US turns to climate denialism, the more you're going to see rising temperatures, extreme events, and those will damage critical infrastructure and property in the US, right? They will destroy regional economies like those dependent on fisheries and agriculture. And they will then have negative effects on the US economy. So Trumponomics with climate change denialism brings with it massive cost to the US economy, right? And that's often underappreciated, right? But it's a very real cost that he brings through his denialism. Okay, so I did promise this return to Obama versus Bush versus Trump story, right? And what you do find is, so I've gone through quite carefully, and I said, okay, well, here's the inherited deficit. So you see that Trump inherits a deficit. So let me just get this pointer back on. Trump inherits a deficit of 10 trillion. Obama, 4 trillion up here. And notice that Bush actually inherits a surplus, right, of 6 trillion. During his Trump's presidency, we see, right, he's got these economic and technical changes, but he's got his White House policies of about 8 trillion, right? So that's that number there, right? And therefore, he ends up with a deficit increase of about 4 trillion. Notice that Obama, right, manages to save only, so he doesn't get a fillip from random events. So he only gets 378 billion, right? Whereas Trump gets a whole 4 trillion that he had nothing to do with. Pure luck, right? Bush loses, right, 3 trillion through these technical re-estimates and growth events got nothing to do with him, right? And so in essence, the luck factor is almost greater for Trump, right? But instead of accepting this as an easy deficit reduction route, remember, as we've said, Trump goes in and he costs the US economy close to 8 trillion, right, over the decade. And that compares to 5 trillion for Obama, right, and 7 trillion for Bush, right? Now, remember, Bush and Obama, that's 2 terms, right? So in essence, Trump spends more than them in 1 term than these guys spent in 2 terms. You could argue Trump had COVID, these guys didn't have COVID, but Bush has the 9/11 attacks, as well as 2 economic crises during his period. Obama inherits a deep recession, right? And he's also saddled with this 4 trillion, right, deficit that Bush handed him, right? So, and he's got to renew these tax policies just that he inherited. So in effect, Trump had it in his power, right, to reverse the deficit, but he went with the fiscal populism through a supply side route and effectively lost the opportunity to reduce the deficit. And I think for me that then, that's key to understanding that Trump's sort of view that he's a fiscally austere guy and is interested in reducing the deficit is plainly not true. So I said that at the beginning, there is a careful, clever econometric way to figure out the true Trump effect on the economy. And economists at Tinbergen and at Oxford construct what they call a doppelganger, which is essentially a counterfactual of what the US economy looks like. So they take a counterfactual of combining other economies, and they call it a sort of control group, right? They devise this doppelganger economy, and they look at its path pre-election and compare it to the real Trump US economy. What do they find? They find very little effect, actually, or very little difference between the doppelganger and the US economy, outside a little bit of COVID effects. But in essence, what they find is that whether you had a Trump economy or you assumed a no-Trump economy, the US path, whether it's just GDP, employment, labor force, unemployment rates, would have pretty much stayed the same. Essentially, there is no Trump effect on macroeconomic performance, right? So the idea that anybody, well, at least we're talking about Trump, right? But Trump in particular can claim, this is the effect I had on macroeconomy, that's the effect, not true, right? And I think econometrically, this work is very, very carefully done. And I think that would, and it would necessarily probably hold true for many other presidents, but in the case of Trump, there is no macroeconomic effect around GDP, around employment, and the labor market that you can claim to be true. Okay, so I know we're running a bit out of time because of my technical glitches, so let's move on. What can we expect in terms of Trump 2 if he is likely to come to power? And we'll talk right at the end about what are his chances. Remember, TCJA expires end of 2025, right? So he definitely wants to extend those tax cuts. The question is, what is he likely to achieve and what can't he? Now, we know that the Democrats are not going to allow the income tax cuts to remain the way they are, right? Biden's already said it, and I think Harris would agree, that they're going to look at middle income household tax cuts and take away from the rich, right? Trump would want to keep it exactly the way it is. So I think that's important. Corporate tax cuts, right? He wanted to go lower, right? But remember, from our earlier discussion, it done nothing to the deficit, right? And the revenue raising capabilities of this tax cut are not there. So if you're sitting with a much, much higher deficit, the highest you've seen, since post World War II, even the Republicans, right, are unlikely to want such deep tax cuts on the corporate side. Okay, so I think the probability of deeper corporate tax cuts in the current fiscal environment, even under Trump, is very, very unlikely, and certainly under the Democrats, it's not going to happen. But should you get these combinations of tax cuts, what's really going to move the dial is going to be tariffs, right? And so you're going to see, and I'll talk about that later, but inflation will probably increase, right, as a consequence of increased tariffs. So if he gets his tariffs pass-throughs, right, increases passing through, and the political battle is the easy one for him, right? They don't want the Chinese. They want to sort of remove the Chinese from any kind of hegemony, economic hegemony, and so on. So the tariff increases are a real possibility, but then that comes with inflationary hikes. The other thing that could happen is if he moves really hard on pushing back against, let's say, unskilled immigration or undocumented workers or illegal immigration, there's potential increases in bottom-end wages, which are also inflationary, right? Muted, but I think that's also relatively muted, I would argue, but still a possibility. Again, though, even if he goes for household income taxes that don't change, right? He may still end up losing because of the tariff increases and the loss of welfare. So his fiscal policy maneuverability is definitely narrowed, right? So he comes in now with this very large budget deficit, which will of course blame on Biden, but we've seen, right? He's got a lot to answer for in terms of the deficit that he handed over to Biden, right? But he is going to then start going to a Congress to then remove Biden-backed subsidy schemes like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act, where these are large ticket items that will increase the deficit. So he may look through a Republican-controlled Congress to reduce deficit by getting rid of what are called Democratic ideas, so Democratic Party ideas. But then, on the other hand, as they seek to look for companies' support in their own states, may end up granting subsidies to technology and manufacturing sectors, again, to fight the Chinese pushback, right? And so one of the things that you do need to worry about, though, right, is what a empowered and emboldened Trump means for tariff wars. So again, if I come back to the inflection point for the world economy is this deglobalization tariff war period we're living through, right? It's unlikely he's going to get his extreme tariffs regimes passed, 60% for China and so on, sort of cutting your nose to spite your face kind of territory. But I think he is going to get, right, increased tariffs on this time far more careful, non-vital Chinese and EU goods, right? Textiles, transportation equipment, and so on. But what's not vital for the US is not necessarily non-vital for the sender country, right? And so what may end up happening, right, is a repeated game. So what if the retaliation this time from China and from the EU, Canada, Mexico is even harder, sort of a harder punchback, right? And the harder punchback can come in through obviously higher tariffs, but also targeting Republican areas, which is the repeat part of the game at higher tariffs. But the other opportunity is they don't go for non-vital goods in terms of what the US economy needs, but for vital goods like rare earths, like chemicals, right? And so they may find exactly the specific products that the US finds essential, right? Those critical minerals, if you remember my previous webinar on critical minerals, they could go for those. Sender countries could go for those and increase tariffs, right? And then you've got what I've called a hot tariff war. So a cool to lukewarm tariff war is what we've had under Trump, right? So eyebrows were raised, people were getting a little bit hot under the collar, but a hot tariff war could be that China says, that's it, we're not giving you rare earths, right? So the entire EV industry and the entire sort of green energy comes to a standstill because the rare earths are not in supply. So I mean, I think those are extreme outcomes because China also needs it for revenue purposes and so on. But I think, a Trump Mach 2 brings with it massive challenges and concerns around a hot tariff war. If it becomes a significant part of the Trump regime in terms of higher tariffs, then you've got inflationary concerns, right? And once you start thinking about the inflationary consequences of Trumponomics, then there are all sorts of consequences for the US economy, right? In terms of monetary policy and the extent to which that's constraining on growth and so on. So for me, the tariff channel and the extent to which it has knock-on effects on inflation and therefore growth through monetary policy is a key one to watch. So onto Ukraine, the US is, of course, one of the biggest supporters, right, budgetary-wise, to Ukraine in terms of military support. Most of the military support is manufactured in the US, so it's basically recycling US military equipment that's supporting US manufacturers to supply to Ukraine. So in many ways, it's a part of domestic industrial policy, right? In terms of US financing Ukraine's war against Russia. If Trump comes in and he withdraws his support to Ukraine, you may see Ukraine withholding imports into the US. I don't think these are major, apart from agriculture, but again, the US is a net exporter of grain. So the US doesn't really care about wheat and grain as much as other countries do. And base metals in terms of critical minerals, Ukraine doesn't feature as strongly as other countries. A Russian victory, which I think is unlikely at this stage, has more consequences, though, for the EU, right? So then the EU's got to step up because the US has pulled out. And then there are all sorts of consequences for the global economy in terms of food prices and the like, and certainly for the EU as it faces increased immigration of Ukrainian citizens away from Ukraine under Russian military rule. On immigration, recall, as much as there's hot air about it, the US economy, only about 14% of the population are immigrants, right? Of whom about half are already naturalized citizens, right? And many of those are highly skilled individuals. If you get immigration controls that decrease labor supply, they're going to lead to increase in wages at the bottom end. And here you do have to think of low-skilled, low-wage sectors. In natural resources, construction. So any of you who visited the US, you know that your food delivery comes from somebody who's not often English-speaking. It's usually Latin American. And those individuals are on somewhere on the continuum of being undocumented or illegal right through to being permanent citizens. But in many ways, those wages are incredibly low. They're not done by sort of US-born individuals. If you remove that source of cheap labor, wages go up. If wages go up at that scale, you are going to see inflationary effects, right? And so one of the consequences of Trump's clamping down and almost removing people and so on in a sort of his second take on it, where he may become more aggressive and more streetwise, can lead to wage inflation. Curbs on legal immigration may increase. So that then affects high-skilled workers. And as we said earlier, that will definitely affect productivity of US firms. And I think the losses have already been seen. They've been clawed back a little bit with Biden, but I think that's a massive concern for US firms at the sort of high end of the productivity spectrum and high profit, high revenue, sort of your listed entities in particular. Just one point about immigration, and I quote here David Card, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, is that there's often a view that immigrants are taking locals' jobs, right? And his work consistently shows that immigrant workers and what he calls native workers or US workers are imperfect substitutes. In other words, they're not fighting for the same jobs, right? So the average US citizen born in Idaho, right, is not trying to be an Uber driver, is not trying to be a delivery agent for a restaurant chain, right? He or she is trying to get, a job in a formally listed firm and so on. They are imperfect substitutes. Therefore, the wage effects and the job losses that you're portraying coming from illegal immigrants that Trump is talking about is actually empirically incorrect. And that's according to David Card, this Nobel Prize winner in economics. And then I'm almost there on the wall. I think it's going to be another mess, right? So Trump is still talking about the wall. He hasn't been able to build it, right, in any consistent way in his first term. And the construction seems to be either stalled or incomplete in certain cases, and in many ways actually ineffective. And I think that's the key point, right? So the Department of Homeland Security claims that the overall effect on illegal immigration is unclear, right? So despite all the bluster and the wall being partly built in certain areas, it really doesn't stop illegal immigration, right? And that's because people don't only come through the wall, as it were, right? There are other access points to the US, given its porous borders, that makes the wall almost the wrong strategy if you want to control illegal immigration. I should say that under Biden, it's just been a softer, in terms of public statements, softer policy, but it's exactly the same, right? The extent to which immigration remains a part of the US political landscape is going to it's going to remain a part of this political landscape, but I think it's more about the extent to which Trump has managed to galvanize opinions by a strategy, namely the wall, that actually isn't really an effective strategy to controlling immigration, but it feels politically, it's a classic Trump populism route. It feels politically like the right thing to do. So very quickly, in terms of looking ahead, remember, please ignore all the who's ahead in the national polls numbers, right? Because they are irrelevant, right? You're not supposed to care because it doesn't matter, just to remind you, it doesn't matter who gets more votes in the country. That's not what determines who wins the US presidential election. You've got to get these electoral college seats, and you need to get 270 to win. And each state has a certain number of electoral seats that are not even proportional to population. That's a different point, right? So, very small population states get a lot of electoral seats that are not matched to their population share. But be that as it may, what does it mean for Harris? Well, potentially winning. So if we turn to a Harris win, she's got 6 swing states. So these are the only ones that really matter, right? Because all the others are pretty much tied up, right? California is always going to go to a Democrat, New York always to a Democrat, and so on, right? So the ones that are swing states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, you can see the electoral college seats in there, right? And it means that she has got to try and find a way to win a combination of these swing states. Now, the big winner there you can see already is Pennsylvania because it's 19 electoral college seats. And I'm going to talk through some of the scenarios. I've just got 2 more slides. But as much as they say Harris has a slight lead in the national polls, everything in terms of confidence intervals on the swing states is a dead heat. So in terms of the swing states, right, there's no difference between Harris and Trump. Can't call it yet. And I think that's really important, right? So let's assume, which is fair enough, that these non-swing states, so that's the California point, so you can see the blues and the reds, right? New York goes to a Democrat, Texas probably goes to a Republican, and so on, right? Oklahoma will go to a Republican, and so on. What will happen is Harris will have 226 seats and Trump 235. Therefore, if Harris wins Pennsylvania, she gets to 245. Then there are different modalities and there are different sort of combinations for her to get to a win, right? To get to a 270. So this is what she needs. You can look at the combination. So if she gets Michigan and Wisconsin, 270, Georgia and Wisconsin, Arizona, you can look at these different combinations. What's very, very clear, right, is that this is where these states are where an incredible amount of attention, money, time, effort is going to be placed by both the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of their electioneering, right? But at least in terms of how the pollsters think about it and the mathematics of it works out is that Pennsylvania is absolutely critical, right? So if she wins Pennsylvania, she needs at least on average 2 other states, right? So Georgia, Michigan, or Georgia, Wisconsin, and so on, right? And then she's through. So you begin to see where Harris needs to concentrate her election campaign on. If she doesn't win Pennsylvania through the campaigns, despite campaigning, it's complicated, but it's not impossible, right? That means she's got to still, though, win Georgia. So in some ways, you could argue that it's a Pennsylvania or Georgia, and then let's look at the combination, right? So those 2 states, if you had to rank order them, are absolutely critical to win, right? Because without those, it's almost impossible, right? And then in essence, these are the combinations. But then without Pennsylvania, she's effectively, if you just look at this list here, she's effectively, here you've got combinations of 2 states in the main, but without Pennsylvania, she has to look at a much more complicated way to victory, right? Trump, it's easier, right? For Trump, he gets Pennsylvania and Georgia and he's in because he starts out with a much higher count in terms of the safe states. But the key thing at the moment is there is no way to call these swing states. So I think that's the key lesson for me you take away from this electioneering stargazing is that any notion that somehow, Harris is leading in the polls. Well, what poll, right? If it's a national poll, it's irrelevant. If Harris is leading by 10 percentage points in Pennsylvania, then we have something to talk to. So if any of you are interested in sort of following these election polls on a daily basis, my strong suggestion is focus on the swing states and see where that takes you. Anyway, let me stop there. I want to thank you for your patience despite my IT challenges. It turns out, just not that anybody cares, we have a power failure in our area and my laptop is not dead yet, so I'm very lucky. But I need to go figure out what's happened to my power failure. But before I end, I just hope this was useful. It's a deep dive into Trumponomics. I think it's around deficits. It's about tariffs. It's about the wall and immigration. It's about climate change. And I think a lot of those themes come back very strongly and in a very powerful, possibly destructive way if Trump is reelected. Okay, so let me quickly take some of the questions and then we can stop. So let's see, there's a question. Sorry, I'm just reading through the comments, the entire 4 trillion deficit. Yes. So I think the point I'm trying to make, so the question was, so a lot of the deficit is not to do with COVID. Exactly, right? So you cannot point to COVID as driving the US deficit because a lot of it is to do with with tax cuts and the like, which have not derive kickbacks in terms of revenue. Yeah. Yes, so Chris says the mastermind behind Trump's isolationist trade policy is Robert Lighthizer. Looks like you'd reappoint him. I think so, right? And it's very dangerous. Chris is right. I think if you go back to an isolationist trade policy, I think all of this sort of hot tariff war stuff starts kicking in. And it's a very dangerous place for consumers, for inflation, and I think for global economic growth, actually. So it's a great point from Chris, because I think one of the, if you had to ask me what do I worry most about in terms of the world economy, if Trump came to power, it's his view and his policies on tariffs. Yeah. Um, Yes, so the other comment was Hillary won California and New York, and she won the popular vote, but she still lost the election. And I think that's exactly right. So let's not get waylaid, as we always tend to do, by looking at these polls. We say Trump, Harris has got this great lead. It's meaningless, right? If you have the time, go and look at these polls which look at swing states, which is what I've tried to produce here. And Nate Silver's stuff. I know people are anti-Nate Silver, but I think it's still useful in terms of his polls, which look at these swing states and to see if there's been any return for Harris, given the last few weeks of events. Okay, well, let me stop there. Thank you very much, everybody, and we look forward to engaging further. Take care. Bye-bye.